Da da da! What's my good cheer? Welcome, everybody. Let's burn a few calories. Let's spend a few minutes together. Let's see what pops up for conversation. If nothing surfaces, I always have my cards, right? Usually, I have this conversation with me as I'm hitting the button, but it always comes to me just in that second when I'm about to go, oh, we're live. And yet tonight, nothing. And you know what? I absorbed a lot today. And when I say absorbed, like I actually truly digested a lot just in my own contemplation and doing the few projects around the house, working on my trip for September. You know, I feel bad sometimes because I feel like I'm being busy for the sake of being busy. But that is better than not doing anything and ending your day the same way or in a worse state than when you started it. And that can be so true. And that has been true for me for a good part of my life. Big part of why I'm here all the time, why I'm so consistent in showing up is just in that idea that maybe somebody would recognize themselves in the experience, that I try in my own way to allow to surface naturally, genuinely, right? The good, the stinky, right? The fun, the exciting, the confusing, the desperate, because I've been there too. And you guys were with me in that. And it's in that gratefulness that, I have somebody to kind of tag along with, you know, that makes it so that, you know, I'm a little bit braver to step outside of myself, to move a little bit into territories that I'm not quite sure of. As a small child, I wasn't always that way, but I found that, as I became not even a preteen, because I'm thinking 8, 9, 10 years old, I found myself becoming very withdrawn in that social aspect of myself. Before then, I would have a few childhood friends. But I found when I came a little bit older, and I guess it's coming into elementary school and actually truly having interactions with your peers and recognizing that, right? They don't look at you like you're a peer. Now, of course, at 7, 8 years old, you're not thinking the word peer, right? But that recognition that I wasn't quite equal, that I wasn't quite up to par, I wasn't quite acceptable. And that recognition came very, very early in my life. It just came into my mind, so I'll just tell this little story. It's a kind of a little embarrassing story for myself, but at the same time I got to take in consideration the age that I was in. And at that age, I wasn't fully responsible for my state of being. And well, we'll let you be the judge, right? Um, as a child, I just started school. I didn't go to elementary school. By the time we were 7 years old, by law, I think we had to be in school because my seventh birthday wasn't until October. I didn't have to go to school technically until I was almost 8 years old. And remember, I never went to daycare, I never went to kindergarten. My social interactions were with my sisters. My sisters were my friends. But as a younger, uh, entering into school, looking at 6, 7, 8 years old, right? My tendency to be withdrawn was quite visible to myself and to everybody else. And, it was because I didn't have a lot of social interactions with people my own age outside of my own family. Remember, my father was a bit of a nomad. We were up and moving to a new place at least once a year until I would say I was maybe 15 years old when we settled in to the same neighborhood at the very least, if not the same house. So there was always a sense of change. And, for myself, I always took that as an opportunity to reinvent myself and try something new to maybe see if I could fit in a little bit better. But when I said that I had to come in and I had to maybe tell this little story, and it was a little bit embarrassing for me because I had just started school and I got pulled into the counselor's office. And the counselor had a little conversation with me, and that conversation was on hygiene. She had a little basket there with soap and shampoo and underwear and couple of outfits maybe, and it was all nicely done up in a basket. And and she gave me this basket to take home, and I was totally mortified, totally humiliated, just for the fact that these counselors had mentioned that people in my class had mentioned that I did not smell well, right? So I was about 7 years old at that time. And I took this basket home. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't say anything to anybody, but I started taking care of myself, using the bathroom sink to wash my socks, my underwear, and whatever I could do for myself. And I'm young at that age. I don't quite understand the concept. It wasn't really something other than go brush your teeth. It wasn't really something that was what do you call that? It wasn't a lesson in the family. It wasn't etiquette in the family, right? Every once in a while, my mom would take the hairbrush to my hair to get the knots out because my hair was very curly. But hygiene, unfortunately, in my family, it wasn't a big topic of discussion, right? Maybe it was, in all honesty, and it just wasn't something that I picked up. But also, like I said, when I came in and I said I was going to share that story, um, I remember my mother um, being upset with me whenever, right, the school got involved in anything about me, even in the very beginning. Like, I was well versed and well trained in how I was going to present myself in school that way, and keeping family matters within the family was that was one thing, right? But I knew my mother would not be pleased if I had shown her what the teacher, right? And even my dad, like, he had a thing, don't tell me how to raise my kids. And so I had that little bit of nervous in me. So I kept it private to myself. But I always remembered, right? Even now, 63 years old, I remember something going back 55 years ago. And I recognize how it impacted me because I was always conscious after that about my hygiene, right? About the clothes that I wore, about my hair, about my makeup. And I didn't have any true sense of style about myself back then, in all honesty. But in my own mind, I thought that I was doing well by myself, right? And being feral kids, just as much as it might not have been on the priority of my mother's list to help me understand about these things that, right, would have helped us out greatly, would have helped out all of us kids greatly. And, I can only knock it up to possibly that it had something to do with her own upbringing, right? Or her own busyness in the life that she had created for herself, right? Husband, home, kids, full time job. That, right? It just got to be too much. And, like anybody else, you prioritize what's important. And, to my mom, what was important was keeping a roof over the house, right? Over everybody's head and keeping food on the table, right? And other than that, well, see, but that was just an example. So it just popped into my mind and I don't even know what we were talking about, but in that moment, I felt like I should share that because you know these small experiences, and we think they're small experiences because that happened to lots of people. I said, well, that's nothing in somebody else's upbringing, in somebody else's mentorship in their parentage, right? It could have been a different story altogether, but in my story, it was very, very traumatic, and it caused me lots of problems. It caused me to be extremely shy. If I didn't know you, if I knew you, that was not a problem. But in getting to know people, strangers, I was so shy in that. And I remember after that, I had problems. I couldn't, right, go Christmas caroling anymore. And that was big. That's how we got, as kids, got our money for buying Christmas presents, right? Because well, we were little entrepreneurs even as kids. And I wasn't able to do that, right? I'd hide behind a tree. My sisters would go knock on the door. You want to hear Christmas carol, right? And if they said yes, I'd run out from behind the bush and join my sisters, surprise whoever was at the door. And if the answer was no, I was like, right? Nobody's going to yell at me. Nobody's going to demean me in any way, right? And so that was just one example, but right after that it was couldn't trick or treat. I couldn't go trick or treating anymore. And there are other circumstances that attributed to these very shy, not want to be socially interacting with people I didn't know. My mother was also a Jehovah Witness, and well, she delved into um, Christianity in all different forms, and she did go through that stage of being a Jehovah Witness. She loved Jesus, right? She just was looking for him, and she took us kids along for that journey. And then, as a Jehovah Witness, my mom would be on one side of the road with my sister Carolyn in her arms, just a little baby, and me and my other sisters would be on the other side of the road, banging on doors. And you know how terrifying that was? And there was no getting out of that because, right, my mother wasn't going to have none of that. And so, talking about those feelings of not being able to interact with people I didn't know, but I didn't have a choice. My mother, right? She was adamant, and you didn't say no, and you couldn't bluff that woman, right? I had to knock on those doors, and people would yell at us and threaten to sick their dogs on us, throw things at us. It was awful, and it was traumatizing for me, right? But these are experiences that I had that helped to mold me into the person that I had become. and had a difficult time shaking off. Later on in my adulthood, thank goodness again for those experiences in the need of putting a roof over my head, right? I started working in bars and nightclubs. I soon recognized that my tips revolved on my ability to interact and build regulars with my customers. And I love that job. I love that money, right? I was a VLT addict at that time, and oh my goodness, that got me through. I couldn't even imagine the state that I would have put myself in. I don't think it would have mattered, right? I didn't have a penny then. Didn't matter how much money I had. I still would not have had a penny because I would have spent it all on the gambling, and not just spent the money. I spent in those relationships that were very important to me, like my marriage, right? I'm grateful. I have not touched a machine in over 6 years now. And, and I am one of those people that say COVID saved my life because I needed that help. I needed that little bit of a break where everything was shut down. There was no opportunity for me to gamble. And it gave me enough space and enough room to breathe, to get away with it, to have some of that desire, that hunger, that lust for the machine to kind of dwindle a little bit. Then when things opened up again, I felt a little bit better. I felt strong enough that I could hold my own, right? And by that time, I had got myself into a debt kind of situation. And so, of course, being in that situation, you do not want to put your last few pennies into a VLT, video lottery terminals. That was my thing, right? I did online uh, poker tournaments, but I only did the free ones. I didn't do any that I would bid on. But I was all about those video lottery tournaments, and as soon as they came into my job, into that bar that I worked in, I was hooked. I was hooked, and it was, I think, pretty close to 20 years and $20,000 a year in money that I have no idea how I generated it, but I generated it and I spent it, right? So it's in those experiences that we have that we build up these limiting beliefs and these insecurities and these little problems that we have, right? Hello, Eugene. I'm doing good tonight. I hope you're doing good tonight too, right? So we can't beat ourselves up for the things that we don't have control of. I think maybe at 7 years old, I think my hygiene was probably still in the hands and the responsibility of my parents, right? I know if I never had kids, I can't say for sure, and I'm judging here, right? But I don't think that, it would be far fetched to expect that the most important aspect of having a family is taking care of that family, in nurturing that family and making sure that those rules that you give your children and those rules that you give your children, that they're followed and understood, right? We were given lots of rope, but in given lots of rope at the same time, there were still lots of rules. I still had to knock on that door of that stranger, right? Say, would you like to talk about Jesus? My mother's across the street. And then I would call my mom, yes, this one wants to talk. And she'd come running over, and we'd all be sitting around some stranger's kitchen table, right? It just was not my thing. Again, I was my father's daughter. My dad never set foot in a church after his marriage. So So I took after him in all honesty. I love church. I love Sunday school picnics. I love the Sunday school stories. I love the morals, right? Because that held my mom accountable in some way in my own mind, right? Because she loved Jesus and she can't break Jesus's rules. No, she did. Did her own my mom did her own thing, right? And again, that affected us, and that was my story. That was my experience, and in those experiences we build issues. So, in what I'm doing is going back there and right spinning these stories and actually going into that story and recognizing what is a story, right? Not a lie, but a story that we tell ourselves or in that naivety of a small child that we perceive something to be true when it's not. We perceive something to be more scary than it is because of those few experiences that we have. And I have to read into it and I have to say, is there forgiveness that needs to be divvied out in there? Is there some understanding on my part, some blame on my part? Did I do the very best that I could, right? Should I've told my mother and taken that basket home and shown her what the teachers had given to me and what they had said to me, right? And believe me, the principals would have gotten phone calls, right? That would be the only reason my dad would talk to a teacher or principal, is if he had to give a piece of his mind. That's the truth. Otherwise, right? Parent teacher meetings and stuff like that. Yeah, that just didn't happen in my family. Okay, so I don't know where that conversation was coming from or where it was going. I hope it served somebody. It probably served me. I'm coming in, right? Make myself another cup of tea. I'll come in after my live and I'll watch it all before I call it a night for myself, right? It was a very productive day, but whether or not it was a productive day, it is what it is. It is what it is. Okay, you guys, here's the card. Ooh. You see this one? There are some cards that in the moment they kind of throw me for a loop. It's not that I'm afraid to talk about them, but I understand that it's through my own experiences that the lessons do come, right? So we got this word companionship. Companionship is the company we keep in trust and in close proximity. Okay, so here's the story, you guys. It came right to my mind when I said that, right? So we're going to talk about companionship. Oh, this is so just the serendipities in this. When I talked about, when I was a kid, my sisters were my friends. My sisters were my companions. I didn't have much interaction and social interactions outside of my sisters. Every once in a while, because my dad was friends with my mom's brother, we would hang out with our cousins, right? But that was maybe once or twice a year. Like I said, my dad wasn't super social within the household. We didn't have a lot of people over. We never had our friends over at the house, though we did have sleepovers and go to our friends for sleepovers and stuff. Like I said, as long as we weren't in the house, right? We were feral. We were allowed to be out as late as we wanted. Um, Companionship is the company we keep in trust and close proximity. That was my sister Tracy. Since we were little kids, me and my sister Tracy were only a year apart. And, when I talk about best friends, she was my ultimate best friend. right? She was one that I could go off to the beach and have fun with as a little kid. I could hang out with her when she was going off with her boyfriend, and we could just like, I could be like the third wheel, and I could have a bit of a social life just by hanging out with my sister. As we became adults, she was able to get amazing jobs, right? And she hit that ladder, and right, she did very, very well for herself. And, when my father died, she became the matriarch of the family. She took care of the family. Lots of times it was financial, lots of times it was just knowing and the things that made us happy, or understanding we had a need, and she would take care of those things. I felt she rightly deserved that role of matriarch. I didn't want it, right? She was doing my mom's taxes, doing the grocery shop. She was dictating. She was running all our lives, right? From her lazy boy chair at home. But I didn't mind that, right? Because it was fun. She made everything fun. I'd go over to her house and we'd, right, make nice dinners, and I could work in her garden and treat her backyard like it was my backyard. You guys know how I love Mother Nature. I loved her backyard. And she would take us to the theater and concerts and trips. And no, I didn't go on any trips with her because I always seemed to be working at the time, right? But my sister was very headstrong. She was very controlling. And uh, this is my sister, right? So my dynamic family is full of all kinds of dynamic characters, from empaths to narcissism to borderlines. We covered all the bases. We covered all the bases in that, right? And so my sister was perfect for that role. I was the oldest child. Nobody looked to me to take that role over, and I was too busy in trying to create the best life for myself. Even at that time, even not woke to any of these ideas, right? I was just enjoying life. I was just trying to keep my head above water. And in that codependent, okay, so this is where it kind of splits off, because in my companionship to my sister, who was my best friend, right, I had in my lessons come to realize that it wasn't a healthy relationship with for me, right? Because that energy was so wiry, especially when she married somebody who was very narcissistic. And, she was my best friend, and I would hang out with her, and it was just so much in my system. I was just rattled constantly, right? It was so bad. My whole family just kind of slipped away, and it was just like me, my sister, and her husband, right? And I had already started in the mindset. I had already delved into a lot of, right, what was going right and what was going wrong in my life. And I could clearly see that I had gotten myself in a very bad situation, that the situation that was tearing my life apart, that was causing me so many issues, was in the relationships, those very, very important relationships that were just too much, right? They were just sucking everything out of me. But in that loyalty to my sister, right? I stuck around. Right? I stayed in it. And that was the very, very last family member to leave, that, even his own kids, right? It was so strange how it happened. And And then, well, not telling a whole life story, but my sister got herself in a car accident and things kind of went right. And I found my out. It's a terrible thing to say, but in her busyness and taking care of herself, I managed to pull myself away from very beyond controlling relationship. There was free choice in that, but that free choice was sheep herded, right? Without my understanding. And in that codependency, right? Because that's what it was. She was my companion, but it was very much a codependent relationship. Her with me and me with her. We were filling each other's gaps, which should never have happened. I should have been able to move on after my marriage fell apart and taking care of myself, but I fell into that and I take responsibility for that, right? And in that companionship, I'm just moving into it again now after these experiences and learning a little bit, paying attention and delving in and contemplation, shadow work. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I think I'm ready. And you know what? My relationships with my sisters are no worse for wear. In fact, they're doing okay. And in companionship, not codependent, but somebody to go off and have fun with and have some of the same interests. I'm now building that relationship with my sister Alice, who I never truly got to be real friends with. She hung out with some of the same crew I did, but she was 6 years younger than I. She was a lot younger than I was, and me and Tracy were friends, and then my sister Alice and Carolyn were friends because they were the babies, right? But it's really neat how things change, and they only change because we put the effort in. And sometimes you don't put the effort in, because if you don't put the effort in, you're still going to get the change. It's just going to be a little bit more painful. It's going to be a little bit more frustrating. And it's going to be a little bit less convincing and understanding and be a little bit more of a battle, right? So I take my lessons. I do only in that understanding that, as we move along, those lessons won't be just for me, right? They'll be for others too, who can recognize that something in me clicked right, right? And that I'm not holding myself um, bound to something that doesn't serve me. If I'm willing in that companionship, right? To let go of my most important companionship, right? And that doesn't mean, you know, I hate you, never want to see you again or anything. This is my family. Never deny your own, because in the end, that's all you've got, right? I understand if anything should happen, I said a word, my sister would be right there, right? Ready, willing, wanting to help. But how would that serve me? Because that's giving the problem to somebody else rather than figuring out the solution for myself and learning to stand on my own 2 feet. Companionship, right? Got a little iffy when I pulled that card because I always kind of want to swing to another way, but first thing that came into my mind was that relationship with my sister Tracy, who was my best friend for 50 years, right? 50 years best friend. I think that's pretty incredible. And any difficulties, any misunderstandings, any bite right? They're forgivable. They're understandable, right? We are all in different stages of our evolution, and some of us move a little bit faster than others. Not to say that she wasn't moving fast, she was. She was just moving fast in a different direction than I was, right? And that's the truth, and that's the truth for most of us. Okay, you guys, companionship. I thought last night was Friday. I told you if you guys want to come and hang out with us on Sunday, right? For our chatters live. It's amazing. It's a good time. 7:30 Central if you want to pop in 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after. It's always a good time. If not, we'll see you on Monday. Tomorrow I am offline. Well, offline in presenting and probably delving into the heavy. I try to keep everything light on Saturdays. Okay, you guys, have a great night. Thank you, Eugene, for popping in tonight. We'll see you on Monday or Sunday.